right, now after we've cut, and really that happens quite quickly, the first thing we're going to do is come to the sewing machine. We're going to sew the collar right sides together. There's 3 seams that we're going to create. And if you notice and understand where I'm at with the collar, a lot of times in patterns, the stand and the collar are 2 separate pieces. In silhouette patterns, I've just done it as one so that it's just a little faster for you to create. If you like that seam line there, you can go ahead and cut the pattern, add seam allowance, or and then just sew it back together to get to this point. Or if you're using another pattern, you can just sew that seam first and then start with where we're at. Now where I stitched is the 3 stitch lines are across the outside edge of the collar, and then of course down the 2 fronts on both sides. Now what I want you to notice here at the corner, and the lesson that's most important here, is that when you come to the corner, you shouldn't leave your needle down and change positions. And most of your guide sheets will have you doing just that. I want you to actually go off and then come back on a different direction. Ready to wear rarely leaves a needle down and changes positions. The only time it does is if it has to. And the advantages of this is, number 1, it creates a stronger corner. You know that that's overstitched as opposed to a needle down and changed positions. The other advantage is a lot of times when I leave a needle down, I have to pivot my fabric several times to make sure my seam allowance is accurate. In this case, when I go off and when I come back on a different direction, my sewing is more accurate, it's stronger, and it's also faster. So that's my suggestion on this collar, is to go ahead and sew off, come back on a different direction. And we'll see this in other cases, but in the collar it's especially important. Now when we go to fold the collar, and that's all I'm going to do. Once I've come back, I'm going to sew those 3 seams, and I'm going to go to the ironing board. And because I've already done it, we're not literally going to go to the ironing board, but I am going to fold the corner, and I want you to learn this new folding technique. We're going to fold the point down, and if you notice, the point is right where those stitches cross, so it will come down. I'm going to fold the seam allowance down, and then I'm going to fold this in to the inside. Now it's critical that, just as we've talked about seam allowances in general, that you have to recognize that 5/8 inch seam allowances will not work here, because as I fold that seam down, they'll cross. But if you look carefully here, you can see the stitches coming up and going across the point. I'm just going to hold that, and then I'll flip the point to the inside. And if you'll notice, what will come out first is actually that point. And then I'll just lay that down. Don't put a point turner up. You'll unfold the edges that are there. Let's just try that again with this point. Now this point actually has more matching thread, so it's a little harder to see. But I'm going to fold that down. I'm going to fold it in on the stitch line, fold it in on the stitch line. I'm going to reach up and just hold on to that folded layers, and then just flip it to the inside. So both of my points, again, are very easy to create, and they're very nice. And keep in mind, here's another one that's been folded. It doesn't matter how thick the fabric is. A lot of women will say to me, oh, well, thin fabric will be too bulky. It's all relative to the thickness of the fabric in the first place. So if we just peek inside here for just a minute, you can see that these were folded just the same manner. My stitching was done, again, just the same manner. Where I've stitched off a corner and back on, it's hard to see because it's white on white, but then know that it's just been folded down, fold in. It doesn't matter which direction goes first or which one layers which. Reach up, just hold the layers there, and poke to the outside. Again, if that point doesn't come out right away, don't stick anything up to turn it out. You're better off to take a pin and pull it out. But you'll see if you just roll it like that, it'll come right up and pop up to the outside. Okay, so we're going to fold those corners, we're going to press them, we're going to press the collar, and if you noticed, the 2 upper and under collar on a blouses are the same, but I've pressed the under collar under just a little slight bit, just so that as it is on the body, that seam will be pulled under. The other thing I've pressed under is the seam allowance on the neck edge. If you look inside there, you see that that seam allowance is completely pressed under, and that really is what I call collar prep. We're just really prepping the collar to put it on later. So I've sewn my 3 seams, I've folded my corner, and I've pressed that. The other thing that I'm going to do at the iron at this time is I've cut my facing, and if you notice the little clips that I made while cutting out, I press the facing all the way on that fold line, which was on my pattern, but I just had a clip on both ends, and then I press the seam allowance under. So I've made that nice tab that's going to come down the front. So that's the second step I'm going to do. After I cut, I'm going to sew my collar, and then I'm going to press both the collar and the facing, and we're ready to come back to the sewing machine and start sewing. I've pressed the facing. You'll notice that when I did the little clip, it gave me a place to fold that. And so I've created a little envelope with the front facing, and I'm just going to pick the blouse up and lay that right against that pressed edge, which is why the pressing makes it so easy, and let that just flip right back on. And the front facing and the neck edge will follow one another. I'm going to kind of just put a pin there just to hold it in place, and a couple more pins again just to hold it in place. I'm always in it, for those of you who know me, I'm always after you all to quit using so many pins, quit using so many pins. They certainly do their justice, but I just don't want you over pinning. So I'm just going to put a couple pins as I work my way down the front. This is the blouse front. I'm just inserting it into the front facing, and I just want to make sure that the blouse is all the way up to that folded edge. Secure that with a couple pins, and I'm ready to sew. So I'm just going to go ahead, and this is actually creating my front buttonholes, where my buttons and buttonholes are going to go. I've used interfacing in this case, the fusible tricot knit. The reason I used it was just so the shadow of the print wouldn't come through the front tab there and you wouldn't see the lines. It's absolutely not necessary, except that in this case my print is, or my blouse fabric is very lightweight. So again, notice here's my blouse, there's my front facing, folded over, seam allowance folded under, the blouse is wedged in between. So that's where I'm going to start my stitching. It's a very simple process, and unless I'm using the interfacing for a fabric consideration, I wouldn't use interfacing at all. It's just not necessary. So notice I'm using the foot kind of as a guide, and I'm running the edge of the tab right there, and I actually sew different directions so that I can use that guide twice so that my stitching on both sides is straight. Keep one hand behind the feed dog and one in front, just so it's a very even process. And I always sew this stitch first. I'm going to do a secondary stitch over here, but I always sew this one first, and that's just so that in case I don't have the blouse all the way butted up to that fold line, I know I'm catching it at this point. So I'm going to go ahead and stitch it all the way there. Raise it, we're going to give it a little clip, and then I'm going to turn it around and stitch it again, which would be the other side of the tab. And you see what I'm saying, I can actually use the same guide the same place, and I know that I'm getting both sides completely even. Keep in mind I don't want both hands behind the feed dog, because when you do that, the feed dog will not pull it through at the correct rate. So I want to keep one hand behind the feed dog and one in front, and just continue to go all the way down, and I'm making my front tab. So you can see the reason I don't need any interfacing is that front tab is going to have 3 layers of fabric. One's the blouse, and then 2's the front facing wrapping around to the front. So we'll come all the way through here. It's very quickly done, it's very easily done, and I've got a beautiful front tab there.